Oh, all right. We're right on time here today, folks. Thank you so much for being here today. This is the very first random review of the season, 2024, 2025. So thank you all for being here and getting us started off right. A lot of you are probably like, who's this person? My name is Brittany Harlow. I am a community library specialist here at Corvallis Benton County Public Library. I've been working here for about a year now. And as you can probably imagine, random review is quite, there's a lot that goes into running each of these programs. And so we've decided this year to spread the wealth a little bit. So you're going to see some more familiar faces from the Adult Services Department hosting these, as well as Bonnie. So never fear, she's still around. So I do have a cheat sheet since it's my first time, so bear with me. We do want to thank quite a few folks, so let me get into that. The Random Review Committee, they are the folks who come out once a year and pick the titles and the reviewers and spend 5+ hours on a random Tuesday in a room together to get that going. Thank you so much for all your hard work, and thank you for letting me join you this year. Thank you to Gary Whitehouse for writing our wonderful press releases. And thank you to the Friends of the Library for your co-sponsorship and support. If you don't know, the Friends started and ran Random Review for 30 years before we stepped in. And so they coordinate and run book sales, and those funds benefit the library as well. So the Friends do so much for us. We're so appreciative. And if you are interested in becoming a friend or having some volunteer opportunities with them, you can find them at their website, friendsofthecbclibrary.org. Speaking of websites, if you visit our Random Review webpage, you'll find the schedule of events and book lists for each reviewed book. And Gail Gerdeman compiles those lists for us. Thank you so much, Gail. We also have recordings of all the past seasons listed on there, as well as on our YouTube channel. And you probably noticed when that robotic voice spoke earlier, we are live streaming this year. So if you're ever unable to come in person, you can view it online via Zoom. I'm excited to be here, but you've probably heard enough from me. So I'm going to bring up Katie Kavanaugh, and she's going to get us started with introducing our reviewer today.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Barb for inviting me to do this. It's not every day you get to introduce somebody who you've respected and enjoyed working with and following her work for decades. I won't say how many, because that'll give too much away about us. Although we did just share 50th high school reunions. So mine was last year. Sounds like hers was this year. So that gives you some idea. But anyways, my name's Katie Kavanaugh, as I said. I'm the Associate Dean in the College of Forestry and in research. And I met Barb. Oh, and there's Joyce. Another ADR. So anyways, I met Barb when we were both just starting our careers. And that was as young female PhDs in a very male-dominated world. And so we've shared a lot of the journey through our years. And so that's where this book kind of resonated a bit. And so I would say that, you know, Barb, I would kind of call her curious, confident, and persistent, which really mirrors the two women that this book is about. And as I could go through kind of the litany of academic achievements, and they're really well-deserved and noteworthy that Barb has accomplished throughout her career. But I think there's a couple things you might want to know, especially about her, and some example of her persistence. And so there's a statement made in this book that cacti are prickly, therefore not suitable for women early in botany. So cacti, because they were prickly. So I don't know if you know that Barb also chose to work on what we would call a particularly prickly species, and that's poison oak. Her initial study was on poison oak, and as the book also labels it, their ability to whisk water through their tissues. I love that line. Probably that went through most of you guys like, oh, I probably don't even know if you remember it, but as someone who studies plant water movement, it was like, oh, what a great way to say that. Whisk water through their tissues. So that's what Barb was studying. And she didn't pick that species because she was interested in the toxicity or any of those kind of dangerous properties. She was interested in how it moved water and in two different life forms. One that's a shrub. Are you familiar with that life form in here? That gets you on your ankles and you get your poison oak there. And the other one is a vine where it drops down the berries and they get you around your head or your face. So that was a real testament to somebody willing to take on a prickly species and deal with that and do it with persistence because she had a fundamental scientific question to answer, and that was the best subject to answer it. So that gives you some insight into the braveness and the journey that she took. And it's not quite like jumping on a homemade boat to float to Colorado without really good maps or with someone who didn't know exactly what the rapids were and where they were. But it does show that serious work can be done by women. And as this book also quotes, the serious work is done by men. Well, this case, we know that that's not true. So without further ado, here is Barb.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Brittany. Okay, so I'm Barb. Supposedly I'm an expert, but I'm an expert on parts of this, but not other parts. I've only been to the Grand Canyon, I think 3 times, but a lot of this story resonated with me. And as I'll talk about, I'm not sure that the real gist of the story was the Grand Canyon trip. I think it was more about sort of truths and what we believe in and how we kind of perceive what's going on. So that's the lens I'm going to use to talk about it. And it's a current retelling of the historic events centering on 1938, which was an expedition that these 2 female botanists took. I don't want to stand in front of this. 2 female botanists took down the Colorado River to collect botanical specimens and make ecological observations. Quick synopsis would be that a 41-year-old botanist who specializes in identifying plants of the Southwest, she's already done this, she's already been to the Southwest before and identified a lot of cactus. She decides she needs to census the flora along the Colorado River because it hasn't been done. And it's where different provinces come together, 3 different deserts come together there. And there are a bunch of other fundamental ecological questions looking at how plants are distributed. And it's a place that's just ripe to be worked on. The only way to do it is by boat, but very few people have done that successfully. And no white women have ever done it, as far as we know, successfully. So she sets up an expedition. She happened to be in this town called Mexican Hat already. She sets up an expedition with a guy there who says, yeah, okay, let's do it. But there's a lot of resistance because people pretty immediately just assume she's a daredevil, and that's kind of what they focus on. So it's unclear whether people are even supporting her for the science of it. She recruits another female botanist and another scientist, and the river runner then builds 3 boats. He just designs them and builds them with a new kind of plywood that's come out, a new marine plywood. By the way, that's kind of fascinating. Just knowing that these, incremental changes in products have made different things possible. So it's made possible to make a whole bottom of the boat in one piece, kind of like a leaf or like a little acorn or something. So he's making that without really testing it. And he finds 2 more crew to go with him. But his goal, unlike hers, is to get publicity and start a river running business. And half a year later, the 6 of them start this 600-mile journey down the river that takes them about 43 days. And they make it to the place we now call Hoover Dam after making it through difficult physical and psychological situations. And in a lot of ways, it's a successful journey. But the author really spends a lot of effort, I think, throughout, kind of letting us know that she's a science writer who's carefully reconstructing this expedition and the context, but in order to educate us that we, the people, have impacted and changed ecosystems a lot. And that's been done through our conscious and unconscious actions. And almost the opposite, that despite conscious actions, in some ways, little has changed for women in science, to the loss of a lot of power and a lot of inclusivity over the last 86 years. So these are showing some species that she mentioned seeing there, tumbleweed and salt cedar, that have become even worse invasives in the last years. So the book got a lot of acclaim. You can read some of that, but I think that's for a good reason, but I didn't personally love it on my first reading. I expected either a more exciting boat trip. I don't know. Katie said she thought it was, or her husband thought it was exciting enough. Did you guys? I just felt like more should happen. Something was going to happen. Somebody had to get really injured or die or something. Or more talk about the botany and the impact of the work. And that wasn't really so much there either. I mean, there were kind of threads of it and lines of it in places. But when I read it a second time and more, and really started to study it, I came to see that, to me, I think the strength was more talking about humans and our culture and what we believe and how we come to terms with the fact that multiple points of view can exist simultaneously, which is part of the inclusivity thing, actually, and how this affects society, how we go forward if you believe in many points of view, and how it affects environment as well, how you can have different people can have different management objectives, but they all kind of flow into what you end up with. So that's what I thought the book was about in the end. This is the author, Melissa Salvini. She's a NPR reporter in Arizona, public radio, and a science writer and a poet. And in interviews, she tells people that she ran into this topic. I think it's 2019 was the centennial of the Grand Canyon Park, and she was there. And she saw some pictures about these women and thought, yeah, there's probably a story here that hasn't been told. And she started looking into it and got more interested. And she wrote a 10,000-word essay on it, which would be kind of long in a literary journal, but not as long as a novella or anything. And then she felt like she just wasn't able to even scratch what she wanted to say, scratch the surface. So she went even more into archival materials, which realized she went into a lot of archival materials. And at first she tried to write it from what we have today. We have, flooded canyon, filled with invasives, lacking sandbars with clear waters. But she found that was a total failure. It didn't really work because there wasn't the contrast of where it came from. And she said she had to start all over, and she had to write it the other way around, from the past forward, from pre-dams to now, from kind of Native American management to current effects of management, whatever you want to call, the passive and active management that's happening. And I'd say that her writing's lyrical, even though she's a science writer. And when I started to look for more of the themes, more at themes than plot, you know, looking less for the people screaming from the water and the plant names and things. I started to really, really actually appreciate her craft. And I'll give some more examples of that as we go. So the course of the book, it starts with a prologue. And I think the prologue was super important because remember, I wanted to see something happen. That's what it started with. It starts with Jodder, the younger of two botanists, in an uncertain state, alone overnight in a steep wall canyon right here. We don't really know much else yet. She's unsure where the rest of the party are. And we also are told right away that Lois, which is her name, and women in general, and maybe even people in general, should not be here. Like, it's a place you can't get to, you can't get away from. And then the author kind of quickly and economically introduces us to the expedition, and the two scientific colleagues that are there, and four others. It tells us the botanist's goal of being the first to formally collect plants from this specific region and test some biogeographical hypotheses, that is, hypotheses about why things are located where they are today. And there was a quotation. This is the journey that we learn they're going to take. They're going to put in the Green River. It's pretty flat up to here. They get into the Cataract Canyon, which is not flat. This is big mishap number one. There's more mishaps, and then they get out in the dull, boring Lake Mead at the end. So this is what Sévigny writes from the point of view of the young woman, Jodder, who's the younger of the botanists, who's stuck there. It was nothing like the sultry summer night she'd spent as a girl in Michigan, with a chorus of crickets and a percussion section of frogs. Michigan was a world of water, hemmed by lakes and stitched with rivers. Here in the wilds of Utah, stone and sky prevailed. The high faces of the canyon walls boxed her in. The river sloshing the shore resounded as loud as an ocean. Lois Jodder was alone. She shouldn't have been there. So we get tension, contrast, and fear, which is kind of good because then the book starts. Oh, that just says the same thing. Tension, contrast, fear, and unknowns. Okay. After the prologue, in my opinion, we're going through this journey where it starts with people holding these kind of murky understandings, and then it goes to questioning categories, whether they even exist. And that's both scientific and management and even the roles of different people on the trip. And it keeps going to questioning absolute correct truths. Is our truths really real? Are there correct answers? And then to actually going farther and internalizing it and valuing multiple viewpoints. And finally, she goes to her note of wondering why we're so devastating to environments and also so slow to welcome diversity in the workforce. So that's kind of how I thought the book progressed, and that's how I'll be talking about it. This is sort of saying the same thing. The book begins here and it goes from murky in these sections through to the book's ending. So this is how it lays out geographically. Murky is a little bit Mexican hat, and over in Ann Arbor, Michigan, people not really quite sure what they're going to do. And then we get into Cataract Canyon and they're still feeling like, oh, there's all these things we're going to test exactly. These are the hypotheses. And then it goes on through the canyon to the end where their lives are basically reset as they are done with the whole experience and kind of figure out what they're going to do. So to start with murky and uncertain, I would say that to start with, the two women who led the expedition, the botanical part, they really didn't fit into categories. Even their roles were kind of murky. Elzada, or Zeta, I heard it pronounced in an interview, Zeta Jodder, a Clover, sorry. She was the older one. She was 41-ish. It depends on if you're talking about when they set it up or when they started the journey. She was an instructor. She had a PhD 3 years before, so she was 38 when she got her PhD. She'd worked before as a teacher in the Southwest at a Mexican-American school. And her field was systematics, which would be looking at things and trying to decide what species they were or decide if they were different species. And that's great. But as more and more people were adopting Darwin's ideas and other ideas about evolution and natural selection, the field had moved beyond just naming things. The field of botany had moved more towards understanding what's an adaptation, and if it's an adaptation, what's an adaptation to? And so her actual field was no longer cutting edge. It was kind of old stuff. And it had typically been populated by amateurs, and people who didn't have access to a lot of equipment. But now the field is moving, and it's kind of cutting out people like women and the amateurs who used to do botany. The standard textbook on botany said that the study of botany seems peculiarly adapted to females. The object of its investigations are beautiful and delicate. Its pursuits leading to exercise in the open air are conductive to health and cheerfulness. Okay, that's great. But Clover studied cacti, and she was a pretty hardy woman, not that delicate. She said she was a confirmed bachelor, someone who simply never had time to get married, but she also described herself as gentlemanly. And others said she was a, quote, tall woman, robust, active, dramatic, daring, perhaps just a little bit wicked. And then they said, she drank whiskey. So she was a modern woman, really, but doing this outmoded science. So that's kind of murky, like that's murkiness. And then Jotter was also murky. Although she was a 23-year-old PhD student, she wasn't doing the old science. She was doing the new stuff. Cytogenetics, that would be like where you squish cells and count chromosomes. And if you think about it, for example, if you have twice as many chromosomes, it would take longer to produce new cells. And so that might be a great adaptation for the Arctic, where you find that sort of thing, extra ploids, polyploidy. Like it takes longer to get started so you don't get caught reproducing too quickly. People are looking at that sort of thing and other sorts of things related to looking at cells with or plants with a lot more equipment than what the women botanists used to have. So she's in the mainstream. She used to be Clover's roommate, so they know they get along. She's also worried about not being married yet at her age, so that's all normal. But she came from a really interesting house. Her dad was a forester, lived in Weaverville, California, and later at the Forest Products Lab in Madison, Wisconsin. I think he worked under Aldo Leopold, right? I think we read that. And he knew a lot about the land ethic. But he raised her with his wife in a house where he did some of the cooking and cleaning, which was weird. Both parents encouraged and even expected the kids to love science. And she was skilled through her upbringing in mechanical drawing, forging iron, and using drills. So she's not your basic, pick out of an average hat either. So this is under my trying to talk about the fact that there's a lot of murkiness in that beginning when they're planning. Some more of the murkiness is in the expedition's goals. So a picture for that, I think. Clover knows the goals. Clover knows the goals, and the guide, his name was Norm Nevels, he knows the goals, but they're not the same. Her goals, census the regional flora, find relics from the cooler Pleistocene who might still be there, who haven't quite been eliminated yet, learn how the flora of these 3 different deserts mingle, including the influence of other environmental factors. So she's kind of doing ecology of the flora. His goal is to develop viable boats and then tourism business. And the communication is kind of murky on this too, to the point that she was pretty alarmed, I think, when she got there and found out the boats didn't say anything about, science. The boats were called Neville's Expedition. And that got picked up by, press and men everywhere. And then as the crew formed, the job assignments sort of fell apart. The women, if you read it, they did all the cooking and they did their botany. And the guys just got to sleep in and kind of, wonder if these ladies are lazy. So another piece here is who would support the expedition? That's kind of a murky thing. You write a grant, you get money. Well, she talked it up and she kind of got support. Guys kind of said maybe, maybe not. They gave her 3/4 of the money she asked for. Not really quite enough, but she made do. And then really by bad luck, Buzz Holmstrom, who unfortunately I'm not going to get to talk about, but there's a book by him back there that's really fascinating. He's a Oregon guy from Coquille. How do I say it right? Coquille, who had gone down the Grand Canyon by himself the year before. And he got this article and some publicity. He was a kind of good guy. He didn't like publicity. But in this article that these people read, it said, this wasn't a place for a woman. It's dangerous. Everybody who goes there dies except for him and a couple other people. So everyone's now focusing on the failures and the hardships and making it even murkier and harder for the women to just get out and do it. And the press even started reporting lies. The press definitely misconstrued the women's intentions. They started even calling the botanists archaeologists and geologists and things. And the last murkiness was the landscape itself. Clover, the older, more scholarly one, went and talked to some people who are geologists who'd been there, and she learned a lot about the geology. And one thing she learned was that no one knew for sure, this is a quote from the book, how the canyon was formed. The Colorado had not behaved like a normal river, seeking the path of least resistance to the sea. It barreled straight into an uplift of land instead of going around as any self-respecting river would do. And I felt that quote actually described the women. They were just barreling through and doing what they needed to do. Oops, there we got it. So they start the journey, and I felt that here they drive a long ways. They drive from Ann Arbor, Michigan to Green River, and I felt like there were a couple of big themes in this next section. One was lines in the sand, and the other was uncertainty in the face of predictions. They're sort of the same. They're basically that, kind of like if there's a hypothesis, you can kind of really be hoping in the back of your head that that's going to be supported by your data. But you kind of know there's uncertainty. You really don't know if it's going to happen. And that seems like what's going on here. As they were driving, there was all sorts of gallows humor. I mean, they said they're going to go. They've decided they're going to do it, despite the fact that, a place across the street from where they were burnt down in the night while they're driving there. And they joked that the clothes look like sad irons, which I guess is like probably those metal irons used to heat. And they're joking, well, at least they shaped like that. I hope they don't go down like them. And then they even were thinking, I guess Neville's had considered naming one of the boats after his wife, but her last name was Drown. Which I like that one a lot. So more of these lines in the sand actually are, as they drove from Ann Arbor to Green River, they crossed the 100th meridian. John Wesley Powell, I don't know, 70, 80 years before, 1879, had come up with this map, which is showing precipitation. And he said that this is arid and that from here, this direction, we need to develop land differently, homestead differently, have different crops and things. So they're aware as they drove over that meridian, and they also saw the changes that were not that gradual as they went across. They also went over the continental divide where, you know, one side goes one way and one goes another. And not that this is necessarily important to the women, but it's important to the writing of the book. The author has selected these things to tell us, these lines that they're encountering. And then another line that she mentions specifically in this section is that as they went down the Green River and it came into the Colorado River, there was a actual line as the Green's deep emerald waters poured into the murky Colorado. So this is more of the uncertainty in the face of predictions. Glover's research questions. I wonder if I have I did this. No, okay, so Clover's research questions. She was interested in, you know, Grand Canyon, Florida, at the intersection of 3 deserts. Do ranges mingle at the river? Is a river a corridor that things go along? Like the cactus didn't reproduce sexually, they reproduced vegetatively, like pads had to move. So pads could float across, down a river, they could float down, but they would have a hard time going other directions. Were there relict floras, meaning things left over from previous climates? And are plants really stuck in certain zones and following certain rules? I'll show some zones later, but this is one of the rules that was brought up here. It's that the field of ecology was pretty fiercely battling this at the time. It still kind of is a little bit. At the time that these women were doing their work, succession is this sort of almost orderly progression of species from when you have a big disturbance to what you have at the end, which is a climax community. So one thing like the mosses and grass maybe make it more likely that something else's seeds will get in there, and then something else will get in there, and you'll end up with different abundance of things over time until you get to a final community. Well, that was one idea, and that would be a line in the sand. You know, this is what's going to happen in a community. But another whole line in the sand was that, and they said, I like this, it was a compelling idea, even a comforting one. So it's compelling to have hypotheses. It's nice, it comforts you to feel that maybe this is the way it's going to be. But as they said, other people were seeing there's probably a lot of different forests that could result. It probably depends a little bit on a lot of stuff, like if the woodpeckers are there this year, and if it's cold, and if there's a fire. And it says here, it did not leave room, it says here, that's my writing, but it says here, it didn't leave room for the complex biological and physical factors that could influence the makeup of a community. So here we're still kind of talking about uncertainty in the face of predictions. And a little bit more uncertainty was that they're finally here. You know, they hadn't run rivers before, and it was just different than they might have expected. There were no real riverbanks. The third scientist who came was going to kill a bunch of animals and then stuff them and make money from them. But at the beginning, he killed a bunch of animals, and they had way too much meat, and there was no refrigeration. So like, what are they going to do with all the meat? Uncertainty of what now do we do? We got these boats and these big heavy deer or elk or something that we got to put in them. Entire trees whisked by them. I mean, that's not anything you'd imagine before you got there. And then there were assumptions that were incorrect that they made. Like they came up to a rock that said Powell on it, and they carefully took a picture thinking, whoa, John Wesley Powell was here. And it turned out it was a steamboat called the John Wesley Powell, had gone there and then never made it any farther. So they didn't even, their assumptions weren't always right. And then then we're still here, have the rafting mishap in which Jotter ends up alone overnight at the edge of a rapid. To the other people, her fate is unknown. It's unpredictable. They don't know if she's alive or dead. They're somewhere else. And to her, she doesn't know if anyone's ever going to come for her, if she's stuck in this place for the rest of her maybe short life. The next part was the run from that mishap, more or less, in the Cataract Canyon into the Glen Canyon and down. And I felt like this was a place where lines and absolutes just don't pertain anymore. I mean, they sort of were working towards that, but now they're really believing it. And there's tons of juxtapositions in here with like success and failure. And then kind of what is success or failure? And I'll start with the contrasts and extremes. They found that the riverbed and a whole bunch of other things, they change by floods. They change by floods and extreme events. They're not really changing by these small incremental bits, which is something they wouldn't have necessarily thought of before. You know, you think maybe the way you're going to be when you're old has to do with you working out, when actually it might depend on the car accident that totally changes you. And that's sort of what they're having. Next, shocking juxtapositions. In the last stretch of the Cataract Canyon before reaching the Glen Canyon, which was a lot more placid, they had their most, they had another really bad mishap. So yeah, I mean, that was good. Got to read that. Flipped boats, people overboard, swept miles downstream, people missing the edge when they stepped out of a boat, mid-rapid rescues. And we get a really good rendition of this about Clover's thoughts. That's the older botanist. She's the passenger in one of these that is being swept through unexpected conditions in a rapid at the same time as this cataclysm is taking place. She's focusing on the mantra of a nursery rhyme, which is depicting a totally different river. The owl and the pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea green boat. Bang, you know, they took some honey, plenty of money, flip, wrapped up in a 5-pound note. The owl looked up to the stars above, and hand in hand on the edge of the sand, they danced by the light of the moon. So she was like entirely dissociating in this juxtaposition mentally with nonsense, the opposite of the specificity that was being called for by the expedition in the moment, but her body and her hands were going through the proper motions. I mean, that's the writer's craft there that she's putting out there. I mean, I'm sure it was found in a diary, but the fact that she's putting it there to kind of move us forward, I think, into this, whoa, everything's different than I thought, and putting things that are as far as possible different from one another into the same spot. So another piece that in there that would also be kind of almost nonsense is the mechanisms of adaptations that the plants used to further their success or failure. Like some plants needed floods to trigger flowering, or like I was talking about how the cacti needed some way to disperse. And these things are all context dependent, which you might not have thought of before. If somebody were to put in dams, it might change everything in a way that no one had even thought of. And dams were being discussed. The next piece was pausing. I think I have a picture for this. Pausing. They paused after that, one of those big bad flips. And even that is a question. I mean, pausing is bad. That's a known thing. You can't pause. There's not enough food and people are expecting us somewhere else. This should be the younger Jotter, and that's Clover, and that's one of the guys. But like, it's just one of the only pictures I saw of them where they're actually just kind of hanging out. It's not a formal picture. And what happened was they needed to dry out their grape nuts, their food. And they had scrapes and bruises and some pretty bad gashes. But they actually were able to start processing things. The pause was actually a good thing in that it let them finally kind of start having a moment to recollect. And in that day and the slow days afterwards, they caught whispers of secrets. And the examples were the names written on the cliffs of previous expeditions. You know, you see a name. What is it telling you? They asked was it an accomplishment or was it their last words? In some cases, it was their last words, like that honeymoon couple. And this canyon had seen a lot of occupation. There were traces that showed successes and others showing failure. And it says that's kind of half-hidden secrets. There were grottos and ferns, this is a quote, yes, but also wheels, buckets, flumes, and cables. Natural history and human history collided here until it was hard to tell one from the other. Probably speed up time. But without the Colorado as an adversary here, they started, another set of whispers was that they started having little to tie them together, and they started sort of having a little infighting. And Neville's even disparaged Jotter, the younger botanist's laziness. Anemic, probably, he wrote, though she looks big and husky. And then he said, evidently, he'd forgotten that both women woke before dawn each day, cooked breakfast, stowed their bedrolls, and sometimes even collected and pressed a few plants before any of the men opened their eyes. So lines don't necessarily pertain. One thing here was we're interested to introduced to the concept of an ecotone. An ecotone is where two ecosystems that are rather distinct come together, like maybe the edge of the forest and the Willamette Valley, the Coast Range and Willamette Valley. And the women themselves were sort of an ecotone in a real sense. They were an example of not entirely scientists and not entirely cooks. Lee's Ferry was a geologic and political dividing line. So that's another thing that's here, but those lines didn't make sense. Like it was supposedly a line that distinguished where water could go, who could use the water. But water flows from one place to another, so that was kind of nonsense. So I think I'm going to keep moving. The next one is multiple interpretations are possible. And also, kind of at the same time, people see what they're set up to see. There were different views, for example, of the same place. There were dreamers, there were miners, tourism wannabes, people who wanted to put in a bunch of dams and not concerned about the spectacular scenery. The other hand, there are people like Jotter who who didn't wake up in the night and said, I made a wonderful collection. So her whole thing was, they often said she didn't even write about the geology or the spectacular place. She was into the plants. But Clover wrote, the night was so beautiful that I couldn't sleep. The author speaks about terrain. The author's point of view now is about the basement of the world lay exposed. Up-thrust stone pinnacles like crenellated castles built by an architect who used teeth and claws instead of tools. There were disparate visions of the same trip. The botanist broke all the rules, for example, by going to that place called the Vasey's Paradise and insisting that they stop. I mean, that was, to them, they had to do that. That was an extremely important botanical place, but it wasn't the guy's view of the trip. We get the point of view of watchers on the cliffside at one point when they're going through a place called Grapevine, which is kind of interesting because it makes sense to tell us what it looked like from the outside. There's these things that they were not sure they're going to survive. It said they were, quote, barely breathing as they saw the boat appear and disappear in the waves. And then they made it to the Grand Canyon, and this is disparate visions of the same trip. This guy Tillotson, who is related to the park, I think he was head of the Grand Canyon Park place, he never acknowledged that these people, these women, were doing botany, which fit exactly one of the goals that the park had, that they had adopted, of trying to understand the ecology of the area. And he just kept bringing it back to the fact that this isn't a good way to get here. You know, this is a dangerous way for tourists to be here. And he didn't like it. He said they chose a most unusual and hazardous means of reaching the park. But they weren't doing it to reach the park. They were doing it because you can't get down there from above to get those plants. And disparate visions of the same vegetation patterns. Oh, here's a place where okay, these are plants, they're native, but they were probably, their distribution was probably greatly influenced by the previous inhabitants who selected for the sweetest of the honey mesquites to grow there, and these other plants as well. This is a grape, this is a tobacco, this is a prickly pear, which was edible, and yucca, which are agave, which you could use the fiber of. There was also the issue that supposedly plants are supposed to be in their exact locations. This is Alexander von Humboldt's picture. This is from the Andes, the Alps, and Norway, Sweden border, where he was showing that different zones of vegetation are at different elevations, at different latitude. But even so, that's a set of rules. And from that, the book talked a lot about this guy Miriam, so I had to show him. He came up with this map showing what vegetation is expected in each place, basically kind of based on rainfall. And from this, he made a bunch of extrapolations about crops. But these women were over here, and so that's a different vision of the vegetation. The vegetation should be doing this here and that there. And there are even different visions of, land management, conservation versus preservation. Conservation is keep the stuff so that man can keep using it. Preservation would be keep it beautiful as it is. So the river reset their lives. It turned flat. They felt all gone. And eventually the botanists sort of settled down. This is a picture of them when they got into the lake, but they're just kind of depressed when the whole thing is over. And I thought this was kind of a good quotation. Barrel cacti saturated and torn up by their foots, bobbed at the edge of the reservoir. Others still clung to the earth, submerged, except for the crowns of the spines. The boats drifted sluggishly a mile per hour. A despondent feeling settled over the party. Journey was over. Nothing lay ahead but a long, hot, dull slug to Boulder Dam. And I think there were a lot of disappointments at that point. People could still get disgusted at the different goals of the different groups. They found out that publicity and money was going to be less than they expected. A third of the plant collection was lost, although it was eventually found. And I think, she really did find some things. She found that there was some relic flora, mainly a juniper, but a few other things. She found that plants really did have ecological niches that were different from these geographic ones, that some species like limestone, some species were shade, some species were cliff edge. And so, they really did have scientific findings. They found, this is one of the species, there's a picture of this that I think is almost for sure this plant, bear grass. And they found a whole bunch of really pretty plants, and these three were probably, it's not there yet, new to science, newly named by them, these three cacti. I say three because the names get kind of weird because they get redefined by people afterwards. And so some of these became subspecies that were already known. They made maps. This is a map showing, can't really see it, but it showed all the Opuntia, the cactus on their trip. So, they got a lot of scientific stuff out of it. But this is an article that is quoted in the book. Who buys the thrills that Norman sells and why? Well, there was Azada Clover for one. The first woman to run the Grand Canyon and live. She was a botany teacher. So they forgot about one of the women. She took the trip, so she said, to collect cacti. It was a gamble. The water was faster than they expected. They struggled. And then it says that she took all the river had to offer, collected some new cactus, and went back to tell boys and girls about plants. That's what we do at OSU and University of Michigan. We tell boys and girls about plants. But something besides desire for rare cacti had driven her, 1938, she was getting on. She had never married. Somehow she felt life was passing her by. She wanted at least one out of this world adventure. You know, I mean, kind of obnoxious things like that. That's 1946. So to kind of finish this, it ended with people have made choices that have changed ecosystems for the worst. We haven't made a lot of changes that have changed how much women can get in. And I was in part of a NSF thing where we had a workshop that we developed and then gave. And we wrote this, women who choose careers involving fieldwork are additionally choosing to prove they can succeed. This need for validation translates to saying yes more often than necessary, like cooking for the guys, in other parts of the job and life to show competence. And that super resonated with the people who were there. In the book, it said that the ideal botanist doesn't smoke or drink and looks like a thoroughly fine girl. And some of our people said that they worried that their phenotype of femininity would make them appear less competent than they were, and others felt that they had to adopt a less feminine phenotype in order to project their competence. And that's 2016 and today. So just quickly, this is me studying poison oak a long time ago. I mean, what advances are there? I didn't decide to go into botany until it was really obvious to me that there were men doing it. If men like Hal Mooney, Terry Chapin, these guys that were credible, had families, you know, were actually doing it, then it was okay. I didn't have to become a doctor. But I mean, this was me, modern kid from the Bay Area, progressive family, going to Swarthmore College. And, you know, it took that, seeing these guys to really get convinced of it. And another piece was, I was the only female for the first 19 years in my department. Luckily, there were people like Katie nearby sometimes. This is a trip that I took to the Grand Canyon senior year of high school, and that's me. And that's Chris Wiscavage, who, Chris, can you stand up? Chris is here. Hey. I found this trip to be really changing to me. And this maybe isn't the theme of the book, but a little bit. I felt like, first of all, I don't like being around people who sing Girl Scout songs continuously from California to the Grand Canyon. It drove me crazy. I just wanted to be alone. And so then when I was hiking, I had always loved to study wildflowers. And I actually almost vomited once because I couldn't figure out what kind of jewelweed something was. And that's when I said, enough. And I, on that trip, said, I've got to look not at this little jewelweed, but at the whole picture. I've got to look at the Grand Canyon and the vegetation and just open up my thought. And it's kind of the multiple viewpoints that can happen simultaneously. I had to see everything because I was becoming way too reductionist. And I think that really influenced the whole course of my career. For at least 10 years, I would not let myself identify a plant unless I had to, just not even carry field guides. And then I wanted to be a plant ecologist, but I sort of eliminated a bunch of other jobs first before I got to that. You know, human ecology and development with Peace Corps, working in the government research lab and development and things, pipeline and stuff in Alaska. And finally, I went, yeah, I actually want to be a plant ecologist. But I had to come back to it after all that. And then there were also, I guess that I would say that the context of understanding so much and so little and trying to keep them both in your mind has been a goal that I've had and that we need to have just to kind of go forward with society and environment. So that's kind of the last picture and a thanks. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try. Shirley Ann.
So the author, she had diaries and journals to work with.
Yeah, the author had diaries and journals to work with from all, like a lot of the crew members had diaries and journals. She also had, like, there are collections of the Jotter papers and the Clover papers, and there were even some relatives they could talk to, descendants. And there are recordings, lots of recordings of, and even some footage. If you Google it, you can see some amazing footage of the boats kind of flipping around in the water. But there's interviews with the Park Service director and all sorts of stuff.
Movies.
Yeah, movies. Yeah, I tried to do it, but I tried to bring it, but it wouldn't download. It's on YouTube, and this had to be, downloadable. I mean, people in my book club had thought she didn't go far enough, but they also said this is as much as she had to work with, and I think she did quite a bit with what there was. Any other comments or ideas? Yeah.
Did Mr. Neville have any success in his tourism business?
Yeah, it still exists in a different name. Mr. Neville's tourism business is successful. His daughters were interviewable. One of them was named Edith, and she was important because she went down with him sometimes, and she became kind of a big adventurer. And
Did he learn how to cook?
probably not. Probably hired somebody. Glamping. Sean?
So Glen Canyon obviously is now sunk under a lake. How much work was done studying the bottom of that before it was
I think there wasn't.
not part of this book, but just
Yeah.
the
Other people might know, but my impression was that this was really important because it did give some baseline for stuff that's now sunken and disappeared.
Right.
Do you know? I don't know, Joyce. Okay, Chris,
When did this
1938,
38?
38. Yeah, and the Hoover Dam had been built maybe 2 years before and it was still filling. Like, maybe it's still filling, I think the book said, which is kind of weird.
no, it's
I do have some insight onto your question, sir. I think it was in the last couple of years, Lake Powell hit like an all-time low that where they were seeing things that hadn't been seen since before the dam was built. And that a lot of it was relatively new because we didn't have great records. I'm from Arizona, so that's why I pay attention. But yeah, so a lot of it was really eye-opening and people were going down to like research and kind of figure out what is actually at the bottom of the lake.
right.
I didn't recognize until I went to book club why this was such a big deal. But weirdly, my book club, one woman had been down it 5 or 6 times, one twice and one 3 times. And they said, you really just can't get to those places from above. I mean, it's not possible. And they said there really was like this fuse on their time because you can only carry so much stuff in the boats. So I didn't get that urgency from the book, but I thought that was kind of important context to it, and that it was really not a thrill-seeking thing. It was just the only way they could do it. Well, thanks a lot for being here. I enjoyed reading the book, even though I didn't like it at first, and now I do. So, thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Barb. I just want to give a quick shout out. Thank you everyone for coming. We'll see you next time on October 9th when we talk about Salito. Thank you all so much and have a great day.
Should I stop sharing?
I'm in it.